The Balkan Peninsula has been home to human communities since deep antiquity, and among its oldest known inhabitants were the Greeks, settled in the southern regions. Ancient writers from Greece and Rome left many scattered observations about the peoples who lived to the north of Greek lands before and during the period of Roman expansion. These accounts, however, were never organized into a full description, and as a result, the picture that survives today is incomplete and often fragmentary. What is clear is that the peninsula was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and small tribal societies, long before any imperial power imposed a single order. In the northwestern part of the Balkans, in the broad zone stretching from Epirus to the Istrian coast and from the Drava and Danube rivers to the line between modern Belgrade and Skopje, dozens of tribes were scattered across mountains and valleys. Greek and Roman authors grouped these diverse peoples under the general name Illyrians. The label probably originated from one coastal tribe that first came into contact with Greek traders and was later extended to many unrelated groups. Even in antiquity, the term was vague, referring more to geography than to a clearly defined ethnic or linguistic community. The language known as Illyrian can be traced with certainty only along the Adriatic shoreline. Politically, these tribes were fragmented, frequently at war with one another, and organized around villages rather than towns. Their economy relied mainly on herding, especially sheep, and the cheese they produced was famous throughout the Mediterranean world. Agriculture existed in a simple form, while coastal groups lived from fishing and, in some cases, piracy that troubled Greek shipping. To the east of this region, from the Aegean coast to the high ridges of the Balkan Mountains, lived another great cluster of peoples known to the Greeks as Thracians. They too were divided into countless small tribes and lacked any durable political unity. Thracians were primarily shepherds, though farming gradually gained importance. Stone houses and urban centres appeared only after long contact with Greek colonies and later with Roman administrators. Thracian communities were not limited to Europe. Related groups occupied parts of Western Asia Minor and territories north of the Danube and the Black Sea. Beyond the lower Danube lay the Getae on the plains that would later be called Wallachia, while within the arc of the Carpathians lived the Dacians. In the 1st century before our era, a powerful Dacian ruler named Burebista created a short-lived kingdom that defeated Celtic neighbours and seized Greek towns along the Black Sea coast. This new state soon bordered the Roman world, and decades of conflict followed. The heart of Dacian power was a fortified complex in the mountains near present-day Orashti, where archaeologists have uncovered stone defences modelled on Greek techniques, workshops, storerooms, and evidence of advanced metal and agricultural crafts. Another leader, Decibel, resisted Rome with considerable success until Emperor Trajan finally conquered the region in 106. A Roman province was established, yet the languages spoken by Illyrians, Thracians, Getae, and Dacians have left only faint traces. The peninsula was never inhabited solely by these groups. Celts, Scythians, and other wandering peoples settled in different areas, and among them were the remote ancestors of today's Albanians, whose role would later prove important for the history of southeastern Europe. Roman involvement began in the 3rd century before our era when Greek cities sought help against Illyrian pirates. What started as a limited intervention slowly turned into a vast program of conquest and colonization. Macedonia fell in 168, and the defeat of Corinth in 146 marked the end of Greek independence. During the following decades, Roman armies fought a series of brutal wars along the northern frontiers until the legions reached the Danube. The conquered territories were reorganized into provinces such as Dalmatia, Pannonia, and Moesia, and after the defeat of Dacia, the empire briefly extended beyond the river into Transylvania. Later, reforms divided the administration into ever smaller units, reflecting the growing complexity of imperial rule. Around military camps, new civilian settlements arose. Markets and workshops served the needs of the legions, and veterans who completed decades of service received land, animals, and slaves, becoming farmers in their former garrison districts. Auxiliary troops were recruited from many nations, and in late antiquity, even federated barbarian units fought under their own chiefs. At first, the Roman colonists remained socially separate from the native population, but over time, the villages of Thracians and Illyrians were reorganized into civic communities that gradually developed into towns. When Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to all free inhabitants in 212, the old distinction between conqueror and conquered disappeared in law. Roman rule transformed the northern Balkans. A dense network of roads connected the interior with the Danube frontier, where chains of forts and a river fleet protected commerce. Agriculture, animal breeding, fishing and mining flourished, stimulated by the presence of large armies. Latin spread rapidly along the coasts, in the valleys, and especially in the military zones. Mountain districts adopted the new language more slowly, and traces of Illyrian and Thracian speech survived for centuries. Christianity entered first through the southern provinces and advanced gradually northward, leaving cemeteries, inscriptions, and dozens of churches as silent witnesses. The founding of Constantinople in 325 and the final division of the empire in 395 placed much of the Balkans under Eastern rule. Yet Latin continued to dominate administration, law, and the army for a long time. Only in the 7th century did Greek replace it as the official language. By then, the region had endured repeated invasions. Goths, Huns, and other peoples crossed the Danube, devastating towns and driving rural populations into fortified centres. Justinian attempted to restore security with an immense program of fortifications, but manpower was insufficient, and the Danubian line was finally abandoned at the end of the 6th century. Across the rugged spine of northern Albania, there is a striking clue that helps locate the early Albanian world. Place names of Latin origin, so common across much of the Western Balkans after centuries of Roman rule, are largely missing in one particular zone, the district of Mati and the high mountain regions nearby. This absence is not a small detail. It suggests a landscape that remained, culturally and linguistically, more insulated than the surrounding lowlands. In other parts of Europe, similar islands of survival are known from hard-to-reach mountain regions, where older identities endured, while neighbouring areas changed more rapidly. In northern Albania, the same pattern points toward a long-lasting refuge, where the ancestors of the Albanians likely lived through the Roman period. Life in these mountains was shaped by movement rather than permanent settlement in one single environment. Seasonal herding created a rhythm that linked highland and lowland. During the warm months, shepherd communities stayed in the uplands. When winter approached, they led their flocks down into milder zones. These winter pastures were often the more open, lower territories along the western Albanian plains, the valley of the Black Drin, and areas farther northeast that later formed parts of Old Serbia. Those lower regions were, to varying degrees, influenced by Roman administration, roads, markets, and Latin speech. So even if the highlands remained less transformed, the people who moved between mountain and plain could not avoid repeated contact with Romanized communities. Roman influence did not have to conquer the mountains directly. It could enter gradually through trade, service, and seasonal coexistence. Language preserves another trail, and the earliest Greek elements inside Albanian, point toward very old contact with Greek-speaking communities. The oldest borrowings do not reflect the later medieval pronunciation of Greek, but an earlier sound stage. That detail matters because it implies that contact was established in a period when Greek still sounded different from its later Byzantine form. These early Greek layers suggest that the ancestors of the Albanians were not isolated far inland from the start. They were close enough to the Greek world, particularly in the southern Balkans, to absorb everyday words long before the Middle Ages. The map of place names and their sound changes strengthens the same impression. In several locations north of Greece, certain name forms seem to carry traces consistent with Albanian speech habits. Some names show characteristic shifts that align with Albanian phonetic tendencies. Consonants reshaped after particular sounds, initial vowels disappearing, and S-like sounds turning into SH-like outcomes over time. These patterns appear across parts of Macedonia, sections of eastern Serbia, and areas of western Bulgaria. Such changes do not prove that Albanians dominated these regions, but they do hint at influence and contact, exactly what would be expected from a population that moved seasonally, traded, and interacted across borderlands. Even major regional names have been linked to this linguistic story. One well-known ancient territorial name has often been connected to the Albanian word for pear tree, suggesting a local, non-Roman origin rooted in older Balkan speech. Another idea, more speculative but frequently repeated, proposes that the Albanian self-name may have been shaped in the orbit of an important inland city whose name survives in altered forms across different languages. Whether every specific connection is correct is less important than the broader pattern. The linguistic evidence repeatedly places early Albanian speakers in the Western Central Balkans, near routes of travel and contact, rather than locked behind a single mountain wall. Latin influence on Albanian began early, and it arrived in more than one wave. Some Latin loanwords show sound shapes closer to the classical language of the late Republic and early Empire rather than the later everyday Latin that evolved into the Romance languages. That difference suggests very early borrowing, from a time when the Roman presence first intensified and Latin still carried older pronunciation features. Later, as Latin changed and new Romance varieties formed elsewhere, Albanian preserved earlier-looking loan forms alongside newer layers. This is what long contact often produces. Older loans fossilize, newer ones accumulate, and together they form a record of centuries of interaction. Then, a new presence entered the scene in force: the Slavs. When Slavic-speaking groups pushed south across the Danube in late antiquity, they did not move through empty space. They entered regions already shaken by war, epidemics, and the weakening of Roman frontier defences. Raids began earlier, but in time they turned into settlement. The movement was not always a simple tribal drift. It could be steered and accelerated by steppe powers, and it carried cultural traces from the wider world beyond the river. Archaeological finds reveal that some early Slavic material culture borrowed forms from nomadic neighbours, and the vocabulary of governance and social organisation in Slavic tradition also reflects steppe influence in certain areas. By the later 7th century, much of the Balkans north of Greece had a strong Slavic presence. One major stream moved through the central Danubian provinces into the interior of Macedonia and farther south. Another flowed into Dalmatia and up toward the eastern Alpine valleys. Over time, this settlement reshaped the demographic balance of the peninsula. The countryside, already weakened, became a field of new villages and new names. Place names are one of the clearest traces left by that transformation. Late Roman administrators recorded hundreds of names for towns, rivers, and streams across the peninsula, drawn from official lists maintained in the imperial capital. These names reveal a mixed landscape. Some belong to older Balkan languages, especially in river names that can survive for millennia. Others were of Roman type, including Latin and Greek forms, and even names reflecting short-lived Germanic presences. In several places, continuity can be sensed, where layers of occupation overlap. Prehistoric mounds, Roman inscriptions, and later medieval churches appearing on the same sites. Yet, continuity was not universal. Many ancient towns were destroyed and never recovered. Elsewhere, newcomers occupied old walls, building new defensive structures inside the ruins. Where a city name survived, it often did so in reshaped form. Sometimes it followed regular sound changes as it passed from one language community to another. Sometimes it was altered because it resembled a word in the new language and was pulled toward that meaning. When a settlement received an entirely new name, it usually suggests a longer break, enough time for the old city to fall silent and for later settlers to return without living memory of its previous identity. Along the coasts, ancient names tended to endure more strongly, helped by ongoing trade and maritime links. In some inland zones, especially in parts of central provinces and in the interior of Macedonia and Dalmatia, replacement was much more common. Northern Albania and parts of eastern Thrace stand out in the opposite direction, showing fewer newly created Slavic names than many neighbouring regions. Even when old names survived, they did not remain frozen. Town names of Latin origin persisted in several areas, while many river names preserved older Balkan roots. A remarkable cultural echo also survived in popular tradition. Old Roman roads and ruins were remembered in folk speech, with names linked to the most famous conquering emperor associated with the region. Roads, gates, towers, and ruined strongholds were attached to his legend, and that legend itself slipped into medieval storytelling in ways that blurred history into myth. It is a reminder that conquest does not only reshape language, it also reshapes memory. The same centuries that witnessed Slavic settlement also saw the rise of a new power in the East Balkans. In the late 7th century, a steppe people established a state in the territory between the Danube, the Black Sea, and the Balkan Mountains. They formed alliances with Slavic groups already living there and quickly became a centre of political gravity. Over the next generations, this new state pushed outward into Macedonia, toward major inland cities and across strategic valleys. It fought the empire repeatedly, seized key strongholds and reorganised populations through forced movements. Such resettlements were not random cruelty. They were instruments of strategy, designed to weaken resistance in one region and strengthen control in another. Expansion also brought new cultural shifts. Christianity spread gradually among the population, and over time, the ruling elite entered the orbit of Byzantine religion and culture. A key turning point came when the rulers adopted Christianity and aligned with the Eastern Church. The choice mattered for centuries. It tied the state to Byzantine prestige and administration, and it also accelerated the blending of ruling groups, with the Slavic-speaking majority. Political titles changed, old steppe traditions softened, and a new religious framework became a tool of unity. Power peaked and then fractured. Wars with Byzantium and conflicts with northern neighbours forced retreats in some regions and advances in others. In the west, a separate centre of resistance survived for decades, shifting its capital from place to place, holding Macedonia and parts of Albania, and using the mountainous interior as a shield. Strong rulers attempted to build a pan-Slavic realm across the peninsula, pushing deep into Greece and controlling the Adriatic approaches. Yet sustained pressure from Byzantium eventually broke that Western power. By the early 11th century, the empire reasserted full control and celebrated the victory in the capital with enormous ceremony. Imperial rule returned with a new administrative order. The conquered lands were divided into provinces, local elites were removed or relocated, and garrisons tightened control. Yet complete absorption was not immediate. The region kept a distinct identity in law, custom, and church organization, and religious administration played a major role in maintaining continuity. This was also a period when Romance-speaking groups, often called Vlachs in medieval sources, appear more frequently in records. They were present in military units far from the Balkans, and they were active in the peninsula itself, especially in mountain zones where herding remained central to life. After the great split between the Eastern and Western churches in the mid-11th century, the religious map hardened. The Orthodox world came increasingly under the authority of Constantinople, and the peoples of the Central and Eastern Balkans largely followed that direction. Meanwhile, the region suffered repeated shocks. Steppe raids, military campaigns, and the passage of crusading armies. Taxes rose, estates grew, peasants lost land, and many fled into forests or sought safety in towns. In some documents, the old provincial labels were revived and the inhabitants were described with shifting ethnic terms, reflecting how mixed the population had become and how uncertain outside observers often were. Out of this pressure came revolt. In the late 12th century, as imperial strength weakened, an uprising began in the north. New financial burdens hit hardest those whose lives depended on herding, and the revolt seems to have drawn much of its energy from that world. Two leaders from the Vlach nobility emerged, proclaimed independence, and after early setbacks returned with steppe allies from beyond the Danube. Within a short time they built a new state whose centre lay between the river frontier and the Balkan mountains, with a capital that became a political and symbolic heart of resistance. This new realm expanded quickly, fighting Byzantines, confronting Crusader armies, and reclaiming key towns in Macedonia and along the routes to the Adriatic. Its rulers pursued recognition abroad as well as dominance at home, seeking titles that reflected a kingdom made up of more than one people. Internal struggle followed, including assassinations and rival claims, but the state revived under a later ruler who restored strength and won decisive victories. That success drew many Bulgarians under the same crown and gave the empire a renewed sense of unity. The social picture behind these events is crucial. Medieval sources indicate that in the 11th and 12th centuries, large numbers of Vlachs lived within Bulgarian lands and were not treated merely as outsiders. They appear as partners, sometimes as leaders, especially in moments of revolt. Over time, their prominence in the political core diminished as the realm became increasingly Bulgarian in character. But their presence in the peninsula did not vanish. A second major Romance-speaking branch, the Aromanians, formed communities farther south and west. In the mountains of Greece and nearby regions, they established their own centres and local states, shaped by the same geography that had protected older populations for centuries. Ridges, passes, upland pastures, and the long-distance routes of shepherd life. Medieval sources hint at a large Romance-speaking population scattered across the Balkans, south of the Danube. But the paper trail is uneven and often difficult to read. Much of what is known comes from painstaking work, with documents written in different administrative languages, preserved in monastic archives, travel accounts, and later legal registers. Even then, many gaps remain. The record is full of silence, abrupt appearances, and local snapshots, rather than a continuous story. That is why the picture still feels incomplete. Not because the population was insignificant, but because the surviving evidence is selective and the old frontiers of language and identity rarely match modern expectations. In the texts written by their neighbours, this Romance population is usually identified by versions of a single name, a label that travelled widely across languages and regions. Inside their own communities, they used another name for themselves, one that eventually appears more clearly in later centuries. In medieval writing, however, the external label dominates. It was used so consistently that it became the standard term in most reports, even though its meaning could shift depending on context. Sometimes it referred specifically to a Romance-speaking group. In other cases, it was used more loosely for shepherds in general. That overlap was not accidental. Herding was central to the way many of these communities lived, and outsiders often tied the name to the occupation as much as to language. Still, behind the broad label, there was a distinct Romance population connected to the ancestors of today's Romanian speakers. And in many areas that identity left clear traces in names, customs, and speech. The earliest mentions are brief and easily missed. A note preserved in a monastic setting that places Vlachs in a valley in the southern Balkans, followed by a later narrative that describes a violent incident on a mountain road, where travellers identified as Vlachs appear as actors in the event. These scattered references are small, but they matter because they show the name already in circulation and tied to real places and movements. After that, the evidence becomes richer in some regions, especially in medieval Serbia, where charters issued by rulers and nobles repeatedly mention Vlach groups living on monastic lands. Even there, the archive is incomplete. Some of the biggest monasteries that must have had such populations in their domains have not preserved the relevant documents, or they have not yet been recovered. Where the charters do survive, they reveal a society that was organised rather than shapeless. Vlach groups appear with internal jurisdictions, defined obligations, and rules that resemble a local legal framework. They are not described simply as wanderers passing through, but as communities tied to territories, valleys, and grazing zones. One early charter places them near Prizren and suggests that their affairs were handled through a form of local court authority. Another document, famously detailed, preserves a long list of personal names tied to a specific area west of the Kosovo Plain, along the upper course of a river corridor. This kind of list brings the medieval landscape into focus. It shows density, not rarity, and suggests that these were not isolated individuals, but a structured population embedded in the region. The personal names in such records also hint at cultural orientation. Many are Slavic in form, fewer are Greek, and the overall pattern points north rather than south. That is important because it touches the old question of whether all Vlachs in the Balkans belong to a single Romance group, or whether different branches must be distinguished. The evidence supports differentiation. The Romance speech documented in medieval Serbia aligns more closely with the northern family of Romanian dialects, rather than with the southern branch associated with Aromanians. That does not mean the groups were separated by walls. It means that more than one Romance tradition existed across the peninsula, and that medieval documents can sometimes be used to tell them apart. Charters also show how medieval administrations categorize people. In several texts, Vlachs and Serbs are named side by side, treated as separate populations even when living near each other. Other documents place Vlachs alongside Albanians, again as two distinct groups, sharing neighbouring terrain. Such wording does not necessarily prove sharp ethnic boundaries in daily life, but it does show that medieval writers could recognise difference and considered it meaningful enough to record. In the mountainous belt of Montenegro and Herzegovina, the traces are especially vivid because they survived not only in charters, but also in geography itself. There, many local names reflect a pastoral world. Mountain ridges, elevated plains, river crossings where wool was washed, and places tied to seasonal movement. Some clan names and village names also suggest a Romance background, and a few forms resemble words known from Romanian speech. The underlying point is not that every name can be explained with certainty, but that the overall cluster is hard to dismiss as late decoration. A strong argument emerges when local scholars insist that such names must be old because they sit too deeply in the landscape to have been introduced long after Slavic settlement. For the names to become fixed and widely accepted, the communities using them had to be present early, close to the moment when Slavs arrived and began adopting the local geography into their own language. Farther east, between the Timok and Morava river systems, records appear again in travel descriptions and later administrative reports. In some areas, the documentary footprint is thin, partly because political conditions changed. As Ottoman power expanded, Serbian state structures weakened, fewer new monastic foundations were created, and the stream of local charters diminished. Yet the Vlachs did not vanish overnight. In the early 16th century, Ottoman legal regulation defined their rights and obligations in frontier districts, and those rules made clear that many were integrated into military service and rewarded with specific privileges. In other words, the population remained visible under a new empire, but now in a different kind of record. The most persistent evidence is found in names. Mountain names, village names, field names, and personal names that continued in Slavic speech, long after the Romance language itself faded from a given area. Many of these names reflect the material world of medieval herding. Ridges, peaks, valleys, streams, pastures, folds, and shelters. Some also preserve ordinary vocabulary that likely came from daily contact. Words linked to cheese-making, sheepfold organisation, slopes, gates, and common features of rural life. These remnants point to a long period of coexistence. A population does not normally leave behind hundreds of place names and a noticeable layer of borrowed terms without living beside others for generations. At the same time, the toponymic picture is not simple. Some names appear to be directly inherited from Romance speech, while another large group was created by Slavs themselves, using their own word for Vlachs to label mountains, villages, and valleys associated with those communities. Those labels spread widely across the same regions where older, Romance-derived names also exist. The combination is revealing. It suggests not only that Vlachs were present, but that their presence was socially visible, enough to become a naming habit in surrounding populations. In certain districts, the two layers sit on top of each other, a Romance base in some names, a Slavic descriptive layer in others, both pointing to the same historical reality. The question of age is harder. Individual names can be younger than the population they describe, and some may reflect later movements from the Danube basin in the late medieval period. But the broader distribution looks older than any single wave. When the surviving charters start at the end of the 12th century, they already describe a world that seems established, jurisdictions, customs, mixed naming practices, and deep ties to specific landscapes. That kind of maturity usually implies a longer prehistory. In some regions, especially where Slavic settlement began early and where pastoral communities were more likely to survive in mountain refuges, the most reasonable explanation is that at least part of the Vlach presence predates the 10th century by a wide margin. The survival of these communities can be linked to social and geographic factors. Farmers and urban populations were often the first to be dispersed, killed, or absorbed during large-scale invasions and political collapse. Mountain shepherds faced different risks. Their mobility, their use of remote pastures, and their seasonal routines could reduce exposure to the worst pressures. This did not make them invulnerable, but it could make them harder to erase. Over time, as Slavic rule became permanent across most of the peninsula, non-Slavic place names were naturally vulnerable. Some were translated, others reshaped, many disappeared as populations shifted. The names that remain, therefore, are likely only a fraction of what once existed. Mobility is the key to understanding the Vlach story in the Western Balkans. The peninsula has long been a zone where languages and dialects overlap, and in some villages more than one dialect can be heard. For pastoral societies, movement was not an exception but a way of life. Many Vlachs practiced seasonal herding, spending summers in mountain pastures and moving down each autumn to winter, grazing in the lowlands. These routes were repeated year after year, and over generations they could become corridors of migration. When political pressure rose or pastures became contested, the same shepherd paths could turn into slow, steady lines of expansion. This long migration can be traced in different ways. Documents occasionally mention newcomers entering kingdoms and being assigned church authority or noble control. Coastal city records describe efforts to attract Vlach groups to winter in nearby territory and, in some cases, to settle permanently. The broader linguistic frontier between Latin and Greek also matters because Romance-speaking pockets found far to the south of that line imply movement rather than local origin. Place names add another layer. Patterns of duplicated names across distant regions suggest that groups carried familiar names from one district to another. When a mountain clan name in Montenegro echoes a feature name in Kosovo, and a village name in Bosnia resembles a recorded place name near Prizren, it becomes difficult to avoid the idea of gradual westward drift. At the far end of these movements stand the Morlachs and the Istro-Romanians, often treated as the outer edge of a process that began much farther east, near the Morava Basin, then shifted westward and later northward. Another extension appears when northern Romanian-type place names are found in the plains of Pannonia. Medieval records mention villages and rivers bearing names connected to Vlachs, hinting at movements that are otherwise barely visible in narrative history. Even small phonetic details in such names can suggest which dialect region migrants came from, implying that different Vlach groups did not all follow the same routes. The forces driving these migrations were not mysterious. Pastoral life encouraged movement, but social status intensified it. In both Bulgaria and Serbia, many Vlachs belonged to lower social layers, dependent on landlords or church estates. Shifting from one authority to another could be a strategy for survival, and the shepherd routes provided the practical means. Access to better pastures and safer conditions often decided where families and clans settled. Later, the Ottoman advance pushed many Christian populations northward and accelerated movements that had already been underway for centuries. Medieval Serbia left behind a remarkable kind of evidence. A steady stream of charters, tax notes, and monastery records in which three populations appear again and again in the same borderland spaces: Albanians, Vlachs, and Slavs. These documents are mostly late, concentrated between the 13th and 15th centuries, and they rarely spell out how long the situation had existed before anyone wrote it down. Yet the landscape itself, along with patterns of settlement and social organisation, points toward a much older coexistence. The written sources may be late, but the structure they describe looks like the continuation of an older reality rather than a new invention. The zone where both Vlach and Albanian pastoral communities are found side by side, forms a long belt along the Western Balkans, stretching from the region around Shkodër northward toward Ragusa and reaching inland toward Prizren. In this corridor, documents show both groups living in proximity, but not fully merged. The records tend to list Vlach villages separately from Albanian ones, suggesting that each community kept its own internal organisation, even while using the same mountains, passes, and seasonal pastures. The common ground was pastoral life. Both groups depended heavily on flocks, on mobility, and on a system of seasonal movement that tied highland summer pastures to lowland winter grazing. In the interior territories often called Old Serbia, Albanian settlements appear less frequently in the surviving documents, and farther northwest, beyond Ragusa, traces grow even thinner. In some areas, memory survives only in a handful of names, linked to Vlach groups, the kind of names that linger even when a population has already shifted or been absorbed. Even so, the broader pattern argues against a late and accidental contact. Several developments look too deeply rooted to have emerged quickly. Among Albanians, the spread of the cartoon style of pastoral settlement stands out, because it was never universal across Albanian-speaking lands. Among Vlachs, the evolution of smaller kin groups into larger tribal structures suggests a long period of internal consolidation. Similar tribal organisation among Slavic groups that survived later upheavals also remained confined to limited zones, which makes the overlap more significant. It points to specific frontier landscapes where mobile, pastoral societies could endure and reorganise over centuries. There are also small but telling hints in naming. Some Vlach groups recorded in Serbian lands carry names that look Albanian in shape, suggesting close contact in particular valleys or districts. Yet the overall number of Albanian names among Vlachs remains limited. That imbalance fits a situation where two pastoral populations lived near each other, exchanged practices and occasionally crossed social boundaries, but still preserved distinct identities for a long time. Taken together, these clues make a strong case that the Vlach settlements in the areas where they touched Albanian groups are not recent. They likely go back to the era before Slavic settlement spread widely across the triangle between Shkodër, Prizren, and the Adriatic hinterland. That would place the beginnings of this coexistence in the centuries when Slavic expansion was still unfolding, not after it had already stabilized. A similar conclusion is supported by the way ancient, non-Slavic place names survived in parts of Montenegro. In that region, Slavic settlers appear to have received many older names through the filter of a pastoral population that remained rooted in the mountains and acted as a kind of cultural bridge between the Romanized past and the Slavic-speaking present. Language adds another layer to the story. Beyond place names and personal names, a small set of words passed from Vlach speech into Albanian dialects along this western belt, especially in areas near the Drina. The borrowed vocabulary is practical and everyday, exactly the kind of language that travels through repeated contact in shared work environments. Some words point to objects and actions tied to pastoral routines and rural labour, terms related to wood, pulling or drawing something upward, and the role of a boy assisting with cheese making. Another borrowed word belongs to the language of the body and illness, and is notable because it also appears in neighbouring South Slavic speech, suggesting that certain terms move through the region in more than one direction. This kind of borrowing does not require cities or schools. It requires repeated face-to-face interaction, shared grazing zones, mixed trade routes, seasonal labour, and the slow familiarity of neighbouring communities. The same maps that show shifting borders in early medieval Europe help explain why these contacts were possible. The The 9th century Balkans were not a stable patchwork of fixed nations, but a moving frontier of peoples and powers. To the north and west, steppe groups and post-imperial societies competed in the plains. Along the Danube, Slavic groups settled into former imperial corridors. Farther south and east, the Bulgarian state rose into a major force, pressing deep into Macedonia and reshaping the balance between Constantinople and the interior. By the early 13th century, the political map shifted again. Croatia stood to the northwest of Bosnia, and Bulgaria's reach had once extended far to the southwest, across lands that later centuries would divide differently. These changing borders did not create pastoral migration, but they intensified it, redirected it, and sometimes forced it into new corridors. Behind these movements stood a larger linguistic transformation. Latin, once spread by imperial administration and army mobility, did not remain uniform forever. In the early centuries of Roman rule, the empire's roads, garrisons, and bureaucratic networks helped keep Latin relatively level across wide distances. As the empire weakened, those levelling forces faded. Regional variation grew, and Latin began to break into distinct forms. The transition was slow, not a single collapse. Different phases can be imagined. An earlier period still close to Imperial Latin, a later stage shaped by local Balkan conditions, and then a common Romance form that eventually diversified further. Any division into neat stages is a tool for explanation rather than a perfect mirror of reality, but it captures a real trend. The deeper late antiquity moved into the early Middle Ages, the more Latin changed from a shared imperial language into regionally distinct speech. Many of the most important changes were phonetic. Some vowels shifted in predictable directions. Consonant clusters softened or transformed, and final consonants fell away in everyday pronunciation. Other changes happened only in certain environments, shaped by neighbouring sounds. Inscriptions and everyday writing show these developments emerging gradually, not all at once. At the same time, grammar and syntax evolved. New ways of expressing completed actions spread, built from auxiliary verbs and participles, a pattern that later became familiar across Romance languages. Case endings weakened, and older relationships, expressed by classical endings, were increasingly replaced by more flexible constructions. Even the idea of a definite article, absent in classical Latin, began to emerge from demonstrative words, a process that unfolded over centuries and reached clear, stable forms only later. Vocabulary shifted too, not only through new words but through changes in meaning. A term that once meant enemy could come to mean army, reflecting a world where armed force became a constant presence. Another verb that once meant to kill narrowed into to drown, showing how everyday speech often specializes words through repeated contexts. New terms appeared for peoples on the frontier, and new seasonal expressions developed into the familiar words for winter and spring. In the Eastern Roman world, certain political words remained alive because the empire itself survived there. Elsewhere, they returned as learned terms rather than inherited speech. These changes did not happen in isolation. For centuries, the Latin of the Balkans remained connected to Italy by sea routes, coastal networks, and the strategic bridge of Istria. That contact left traces. A number of small but distinctive expressions and meanings are shared between Romanian and certain Italian dialects, especially in the north and along the Adriatic corridor. Some shared phrases are too specific to be easily dismissed as coincidence, and some shared vocabulary shows a pattern of old contact that lasted longer than is often imagined. Romanian also shares certain words with dialects in the Italian northeast, and other parallels link it to parts of southern Italy as well. Some of these similarities may reflect ancient features preserved in separate places. Others look like innovations that travelled through contact. Either way, they point to a long Adriatic communication zone that did not vanish overnight when imperial power weakened. Out of this complex field emerged what can be described as a Balkan form of Latin, an Eastern Romance continuum shaped by the Danubian provinces, the Adriatic coast, and the interior road system. It was not Balkan because of a single ethnic base, since the older substrata included multiple ancient peoples. It was Balkan because geography and history created a cultural unity distinct from Western Romance. In this zone, certain Western Romance traits did not dominate, while Eastern traits, such as the weakening of final consonants and the preservation of certain consonant patterns, became more visible. Within this continuum, Romanian developed alongside now extinct Dalmatian and alongside the Latin layers that entered Albanian and South Slavic speech through long coexistence. The frontier between Latin-dominant and Greek-dominant regions in late antiquity can be traced broadly through inscriptions and administrative patterns. It ran from the Adriatic inland through mountainous districts and across key provincial centres, then bent toward the Black Sea, marking a zone where Latin held stronger ground to the north and west, while Greek dominated more strongly to the south and east. Yet even that frontier was not a razor line. Bilingual spaces must have existed on both sides, and local conditions could reverse the pattern in particular valleys or cities. To the north, Roman influence reached the Danube early, and for a time imperial frontiers extended beyond it into parts of Transylvania. That northern expansion did not last. After the withdrawal from Dacia, the Danube became once again the stable frontier for several centuries. The edge, not only of the empire's military system, but also of the main territory, where Balkan Latin continued to function in a relatively coherent form. During the same long interval, the Western Balkans remained a meeting ground, Slavic settlements spreading through the interior. Bulgarian power rising and falling, Albanian and Vlach pastoral communities sharing corridors from Shkoda to Prizren, and Latin speech gradually reshaping into the early forms that would eventually become Romanian. Several sound changes help trace how different Romance varieties split and how some regions stayed conservative while others innovated. One Old Latin consonant that often weakened elsewhere remained surprisingly stable in a few peripheral areas. Romanian, Albanian, and Sardinian keep a clear reflex of this consonant in inherited words, so Latin forms like gula, lupus, and numerus show outcomes that still preserve that hard consonantal shape, rather than collapsing into softer sounds. Another well-known shift concerns the Latin diphthong au. In some late inscriptions, the diphthong is already being pronounced more like a simple o. An ancient school tradition even complains about rural speakers using a reduced form in words connected with gold. The change seems to have spread into Rome through contact and movement of people after the social war period. Yet the older AU survived far longer in a broad belt of Romance varieties, especially where the syllable carried stress. Romanian and several other regional Romance forms still show an OU-type outcome in words like AR and in descendants of laudare, while Albanian borrowed many Latin words with AU, but regularly simplified it to a plain A, so aurum becomes AR and paucum becomes pac. The contrast is important because it shows that a single Latin feature could develop in different directions, depending on the receiving speech community and the timing of contact. Consonants in the middle of words tell a similar story. In many Western Romance areas, the voiceless stops between vowels, PTTK, tended to soften and become voiced, and the earliest hints already appear in informal writing on walls and tablets in Italy, where spellings reveal pronunciation moving from P toward B and from K toward G. After late antiquity, this voicing became widespread in the West, though some isolated dialect zones resisted it. In Balkan Latin, by contrast, the older voiceless stops were kept with notable consistency. Romanian outcomes of Pakare and Ripa show that the inherited consonants stayed unvoiced rather than shifting into the softer Western pattern. This is one of the clearest cases where Balkan Romance looks conservative next to much of the West. A different cluster of changes involves Latin Q and Gu. In popular speech, Q often lost its lip rounding and could be heard more like a plain K sound, a tendency that ancient grammarians noticed and mocked. In most environments, this produced outcomes like K rather than KW, but the exact results vary by region. Sardinian and Romanian align in several key items. In front of vowels other than A, QU can end up as a P-type reflex, so aqua yields a form with P in Romanian, and equa shows a similar direction. Some words with quader also move into B or P like outcomes in Sardinian, with Romanian preserving parallel developments in a smaller set. Yet before A, only a restricted group shows delabialization in certain Eastern and island varieties, and elsewhere Q remained closer to its original shape. Albanian does not follow these Romance developments, because when it borrowed Latin words containing Q, it typically adapted them with a K sound, so quatuor becomes cater, and the word for the fasting season from quadragesima appears with an initial K sound as well. The same broad pattern extends to gu in a few cases. Latin lingua turns into limba in Sardinian and limba in Romanian, showing a shared treatment of the consonant cluster, though some high-frequency words can behave irregularly. Other consonant groups also reveal staged change. Latin CL, for instance, matches a CH sound in northern Romanian, so clavis leads to a form like chi. Some southern Romanian dialects preserve an intermediate KL-like stage, suggesting that the shift did not happen overnight, but passed through a transitional pronunciation before reaching the palatalized outcome. Italian and French moved differently, with Italian developing Chiave and French keeping a more recognizable CL in spelling even as pronunciation evolved. Even small endings matter. A well-known change in parts of Italy is the loss of final S in certain plural forms and the rise of an I ending, producing patterns like Monte. Romanian has comparable plural outcomes in inherited words that reflect similar pressures on word final consonants, though French often preserves a written S, even when it is not pronounced. These parallel pressures do not automatically mean direct borrowing, but they show how multiple Romance varieties could be pushed by similar phonetic tendencies. Vocabulary paints a broader social picture. When inherited Latin words in Romanian are counted and compared across Romance, the core pan-Romance stock is large, but Romanian diverges in striking ways. Many inherited words survive only in Romanian, often with new formations and frequent shifts in meaning. At the same time, a surprisingly high portion of the wider Romance inherited stock is simply absent from Romanian. The missing items are not random. Many belong to domains linked to urban life, seafaring, commerce, organized administration, and certain technical crafts. Words tied to everyday city culture, amenities, and institutions are especially scarce. The overall impression is that Romanian inherited Latin through a speech community, where simplification was strong, and where many specialized synonyms collapsed into a single dominant term. A whole set of Latin verbs for weeping, for example, can shrink down to one inherited verb that covers crying in general. Inherited terms for complex urban occupations, formal schooling, public administration, and parts of institutional religion are also relatively limited compared with other Romance languages. This does not prove a single historical scenario by itself, but it fits a picture of communities whose inherited Latin developed largely outside dense city networks. Word-building habits reinforce the same impression of shared Eastern tendencies. Certain prefixes are especially productive both in Italian dialect zones and in Romanian. A reduced form of X can appear in verbs meaning to shorten or to set down, while extra can intensify adjectives and create meanings like very old or very ancient, and in can form verbs with senses like becoming young again. These parallel patterns show that Romanian did not only inherit isolated words, but also retained productive ways of forming new vocabulary. Meaning change is even more revealing, because it connects language to livelihood. In many languages, ordinary words can become trade terminology when a social group adopts them for a specialized purpose. Once that happens, the meaning often narrows and the specialized sense can eventually replace the older general sense. French offers classic examples where everyday verbs shifted into farmyard language. In Romanian, a comparable process can be seen in a group of inherited Latin words that drift into the world of herding. A word that once meant midday can become the place where animals rest at midday. A general word for animals can narrow to small livestock. A term associated with cavalry units can become the ordinary word for a flock. Words once linked to military gear or threatening movement can be reinterpreted as driving and goading animals. Even colour terms can become labels for a particular type of sheep marking. Taken together, these shifts point toward a community where herding played a central economic role for long periods, enough to reshape the inherited Latin lexicon from the inside. Behind these developments lies the harder question of what language or languages existed before Latin in the region where Romanian formed. Labels like Thracian, Dacian, or Illyrian are often used, but the surviving evidence is thin, heavily weighted toward place names, and rarely transparent in meaning. Because direct documentation is scarce, researchers have proposed methodological rules, rather than simple answers. One approach begins by collecting Romanian elements with uncertain origin and comparing them first with what little can be reconstructed from ancient Balkan remains. If no secure match exists, the search expands to other old Balkan languages and then to Albanian, which preserves a large non-Slavic, non-Romance core that is widely considered to continue an ancient Balkan language. Broader Indo-European comparisons may be attempted, but they only become persuasive when actual word forms can be matched with clear sound correspondences and the whole structure of the word is explained, not just a vague root similarity. Even with careful rules, many proposed etymologies remain shaky, and lists of supposed substratum words often contain items that cannot be demonstrated with confidence. What stands out, again and again, is that a large share of the features sometimes assigned to an undefined Balkan substratum appear in a single living language, with strong continuity in the region, Albanian. This is true across sound patterns, grammar, and vocabulary. Romanian has a central vowel often written as a, and Albanian has a very similar vowel in comparable, unstressed environments, with parallel developments from unstressed a and from vowels before nasals. The distribution is not identical, but the similarities are extensive enough that purely independent coincidence becomes harder to defend in every case. Shared treatment of certain consonant clusters strengthens the connection. Romanian famously turns Latin CT into PT in many common words, and CS into PS under certain stress conditions. Albanian shows partially comparable outcomes, sometimes producing FT or IT type results depending on the surrounding vowels, and often treating CS in ways that mirror the same stress sensitivity. Different explanations compete here. Some see the changes as internal Romance evolution, driven by preferences for open syllables. Others argue that the pre-Latin speech habits of the region made clusters like KT unstable and pushed both Albanian and Balkan Romance toward similar repairs. The evidence can be read in more than one way, but the repeated convergence between Romanian and Albanian remains a key fact to account for. Other shared consonant patterns appear in Latin sequences like LV and RV, shifting toward LB and RB in both languages, producing parallel shapes in words related to saving, wildness, dust, and service. Beyond individual sounds, the two languages show a striking compatibility in how word endings behave. Certain final vowels are retained, others weaken, and many disappear, creating a broadly similar rhythm of word shapes, even when the words themselves are not identical. Grammar brings the relationship into sharper focus. Romanian and Albanian both place the definite article after the noun, and they share fine details in when the article is omitted, how double determination is expressed, and how possessive marking interacts with definiteness. Bulgarian also developed a postposed article, but its timing appears later, and the tight match in small structural choices between Romanian and Albanian suggests long contact and shared aerial pressures, rather than mere chance. Similar parallelism appears in the creation of indefinite pronouns, in the way certain feminine pronoun forms can stand in for a neutral it sense, and in the building of ordinal numerals where forms meaning before or in front yield the word for first. Some verb constructions also converge. Both languages can replace an infinitive with a participial or verbal noun construction in obligation like meanings, a pattern that later becomes one of the best-known Balkan traits. The shared vocabulary between Romanian and Albanian is especially concentrated in the daily world of mountain herding and rural life. Body parts, basic family terms, fences and hearths, tools, animal names, plants, landforms, and an unusually large block of shepherd terminology. This concentration matters because it argues against random similarity. It also complicates the question of borrowing direction. In many cases, there is no decisive phonetic clue to prove that a Romanian word came from Albanian or the reverse. Still, a few items show unmistakable Albanian-style sound reduction that Romanian would not have produced internally, suggesting at least some borrowing in specific cases. The larger picture, though, is that most of the shared non-Latin core likely comes from an older common layer, inherited by Albanian directly and preserved in Romanian as a substratum beneath its Latin base. Dalmatian adds another piece to the map. It was spoken along the Adriatic coast and islands until modern times, with its last known speaker dying at the end of the 19th century. Its position between Italy and the Balkan interior made it a linguistic bridge. In some respects, early Dalmatian resembled Western Romance in its vowel system, but in its consonants it often aligned more closely with Romanian, preserving stops and certain clusters in ways that the West had already weakened. This conservatism can be tied to the historical isolation created when Slavic settlement disrupted the old Romance continuum across the Balkans. Dalmatian also shares a set of fine-grained lexical choices and meanings with Italian dialects, Albanian and Romanian, reflecting the period when Romance speech formed an almost continuous chain from Italy across the eastern Adriatic into the Balkan hinterland. All of this fits into the broader pattern known as the Balkan linguistic area, where unrelated languages converged through long contact. Over many centuries, shared religious and cultural frameworks, widespread bilingualism, and the mobility of pastoral groups spread habits of expression across Greek, Albanian, Romanian, South Slavic, and to a lesser extent other languages. Some scholars object to treating this as a unified linguistic discipline, arguing that inheritance still matters more than surface convergence. Yet the depth and number of shared structures are hard to dismiss. The core of the Balkan area is usually seen in the strongest convergence between Albanian, Romanian, and Bulgarian, with other languages showing partial participation. In this setting, Romanian can be understood as a Romance language whose phonology and core lexicon are Latin in origin, but whose deeper shape was strongly guided by the older Balkan environment, especially through prolonged interaction with the population that continued the ancient language, now represented by Albanian. Across the Balkan Peninsula, a remarkable linguistic pattern developed over many centuries. Greek, Albanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Rumanian belong to different families, yet they share structures that cannot be explained by chance. One of the clearest examples is the way these languages express the future tense. Instead of inherited ancient forms, they all began to use auxiliary verbs meaning want or will. Greek employed a construction with a verb meaning to want, followed by an infinitive, and similar formations appeared in Bulgarian, Serbian, and Romanian. Over time, as the infinitive weakened, these languages replaced it with clauses introduced by small particles. The same mechanism can be seen from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, showing a common grammatical evolution, rather than isolated change. Another shared tendency was the gradual disappearance of the infinitive. Greek abandoned it almost completely, keeping only a few frozen forms. In southern Albanian, it survived only in rare expressions, while northern Albanian kept it more fully. Romanian preserved two shapes of the infinitive, but in everyday speech it was steadily replaced by subordinate clauses, with the subjunctive. Bulgarian followed the same path, and even in Serbian areas close to Romanian, the older infinitive began to retreat. What is striking is not simply that the infinitive faded, but that all these languages replaced it, in exactly the same way, using parallel conjunctions and identical word order. The verb always follows the conjunction directly, separated only by a negative or a short pronoun. Such uniformity points to intense bilingual contact. The influence of Greek reached far beyond grammar into vocabulary and phraseology. From the early centuries of the Christian era, Greek words flowed into Balkan Latin and later into Romanian. Some can be dated by their sound. Older borrowings kept a simple U sound, while later ones show a fronted pronunciation. Words for everyday objects, emotions, and religious life entered the language. Terms for hut, ship, fear, witness, freshness, and countless others. Many of these same items appear in Albanian and Bulgarian, revealing a shared cultural layer. Even more revealing are loan translations. Instead of borrowing the word itself, speakers translated Greek expressions piece by piece. The idea of Great Week for Passion Week, or Week of Cheese for the days before Lent, appears identically in Romanian, Bulgarian, and Serbian. The metaphor of the navel as the centre of the world, or the use of the word for lip to mean the edge of a cup or field, follows Greek models. To describe a quarrel, all these languages use the image of eating oneself with someone. Such parallels are too precise to be accidental. They reflect a long period in which Greek culture shaped the mental imagery of its neighbours. Religious translations strengthen this influence. Biblical Greek phrases entered daily speech, teaching people to say a word where English would say something, or to add of days after week, month, and year. Hundreds of similar turns of phrase spread through sermons and liturgy, giving the Balkan languages a common rhythm and logic. The Slavic arrival added another powerful layer. From the 7th century onwards South Slavic speech interacted closely with Romanian communities. The earliest Slavic loans show very old sound forms, proving that contact began before the 9th century. Later, during the Bulgarian Empire, thousands of new words entered northern Romanian, terms for law, war, authority, church organization, and daily life. Prefixes and suffixes of Slavic origin became productive, creating new Romanian words as if they were native tools. This influence reshaped not only vocabulary, but also structure. The reflexive verb expanded under Slavic models, and Romanian developed a simple future formed exactly like Bulgarian. Even the way reported speech preserves the original tense mirrors Slavic habits, rather than Romance ones. Numerals from 11 to 19 follow the pattern 1/10, identical to Slavic and Albanian formations. Bulgarian, in turn, absorbed features from Romanian. The loss of grammatical cases, the use of the preposition "na" for the dative, and the postposed definite article all resemble Romanian practice. Dozens of Romanian words, especially from shepherd life, entered Bulgarian dialects. The exchange was mutual and deep. The religious vocabulary illustrates two historical layers. Basic Christian terms, church, cross, angel, sin, Easter, come from Latin and Greek and must have reached the ancestors of the Rumanians during the Roman period. A second, larger group comes from Slavic and relates to church hierarchy, monastic life, and liturgy, showing that the Vlachs were organized into the Orthodox Church under Bulgarian influence after the 9th century. Behind these linguistic facts lies a portrait of the early Romanian way of life. Many everyday expressions are drawn from shepherd imagery. To wean a child uses the verb that originally meant to put into a sheepfold. Words for coagulating milk describe the formation of thoughts or fortunes. Age is compared to grazing on the same grass, and danger is pictured as something that grazes a person. Place names of Romanian origin scattered across Balkan mountains, and medieval documents from Serbia describing Vlachs as herders and caravan drivers confirm this pastoral background. From this common cradle emerged several dialects. Northern Romanian developed north of the Danube and later became the literary language. Istro-Romanian survives in small communities of Istrita, now nearly extinct. Aromanian, spoken in the Pindus and surrounding regions, retains many ancient traits and a modest literature. Meglanitic, once heard near Thessaloniki, has almost disappeared. These dialects share so many innovations that they must have formed a single language for centuries, before separating around the year 1000. Within northern Romanian, regional speech varies, yet not as dramatically as in other Romance lands. Transylvania does not possess a single distinct dialect. Instead, features from Muntenia, Moldavia, the Banat, and Maramuresh flow into it. Vocabulary differences, such as various words for snow, belly, or maize, map cultural contacts more than ancient boundaries. Over the long centuries of the Middle Ages, the communities known as the Vlachs followed two different paths. Part of the population gradually settled as farmers, building villages and cultivating the valleys. Yet a large portion remained faithful to an older way of life. These people continued to move with their herds across mountains and plains, crossing frontiers that had little meaning to them. Their seasonal migrations carried them far beyond the lower Danube into the Carpathians, the Apuseni Mountains, the Ruthenian Highlands, Slovakia, Moravia, southern Poland, the Ukrainian steppe, and even the distant lands of southern Russia. Traces of these movements survive most clearly not in chronicles, but in language. Across Central and Eastern Europe, many tongues preserve words that arrived with Vlach shepherds. Slovak, Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Hungarian, and the German dialect of the Transylvanian Saxons all contain a layer of vocabulary that points unmistakably to Rumanian origins. The great majority of these borrowings belong to the world of pastoral life. The names of sheep breeds, cheeses, huts, flocks, tools, and the hierarchy of shepherds themselves. This pattern suggests that the Vlachs were not passive settlers, but active transmitters of a specialized mountain culture. In Hungarian, some of the oldest loans referred directly to sheep raising. Words for ram, cheese, fold, shepherd cottage, flute, and the chief herdsman entered the language at an early stage. The same phenomenon appears among the Saxon Germans of Transylvania, whose speech adopted terms for flock, whey, buttermilk, and the instruments of mountain herding. These were not isolated curiosities, but part of a wider exchange that shaped rural life on both sides of the Carpathians. The Slavic world absorbed an even richer set of expressions. Ukrainian contains dozens of words that clearly reflect Romanian forms. Names of plants such as blueberries and sorrel. Items of clothing, carts and bridles, food like maize porridge, and verbs connected with digging or tending animals. Russian inherited a similar group, including terms for soft cheese, pancakes, tilled fields, and even abstract notions such as play or beauty marks. Polish dialects along the mountains echo the same vocabulary, with shepherd titles, hut names, bags, lentils, and supernatural beings drawn from Romanian tradition. In Slovakia and Moravia, the influence is especially concentrated in the language of mountain shepherds. Studies have identified around 30 specifically northern Romanian terms used in remote valleys. These include words for buckets, vats, rennet, beestings, sheepfolds, and various breeds distinguished by colour or wool quality. Personal names of Romanian origin appear in medieval records, from Galicia and Moravia, showing that individuals as well as words travelled along these routes. When the semantic fields of all these loans are examined, a clear picture emerges. The largest category by far relates to shepherd terminology. Other groups include plants, animals, body parts, family relations, tools, clothing, food and drink, and only secondarily administrative or military concepts. The structure of this vocabulary indicates that the Vlachs arrived primarily as mobile pastoralists, rather than as peasants tied to the soil. Only communities accustomed to long-distance herding could have spread their language so widely without establishing dense agricultural colonies. The Vlachs were not disorganized wanderers. Medieval documents describe their own forms of leadership, known under titles such as kneses, village chiefs, and clan heads. They carried with them a customary law, the jus Wallachicum, recognized in several Balkan states. In the southern Balkans, some Vlach leaders rose to high positions as administrators, churchmen, and even founders of local polities. The dynasty that created the Second Bulgarian Empire emerged from this milieu. Yet the majority remained humble shepherds, gradually blending into the Slavic populations of the north. In Slovakia, Bohemia, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, they were eventually assimilated, leaving behind only the linguistic footprints of their presence. From this common stock, several Romanian dialects took shape. Northern Romanian, spoken beyond the Danube, became the basis of the modern literary language. Istro-Romanian survived in isolated villages of Istria. Aromanian developed in the mountains of Greece and Albania with its own modest literature. Meglanitic once existed near Thessaloniki. These varieties share enough innovations to prove that they separated relatively late, around the turn of the first millennium. Debate over the birthplace of the Romanian language has lasted for centuries. One influential view holds that it descended directly from the Latin spoken in the Roman province of Dacia. established by Trajan and abandoned by Aurelian. According to this theory, the Romanized population north of the Danube survived the withdrawal of imperial administration and eventually gave rise to the modern nation. This idea first appeared in the writings of Renaissance humanists, who were struck by the similarity between Italian and the speech of the Vlachs. Later chroniclers in Moldavia and Wallachia embraced the notion with patriotic enthusiasm, portraying the Rumanians as heirs of Roman colonists transplanted to Dacia. During the 18th century, the Transylvanian school transformed the concept into a program of national awakening, emphasizing Latin roots and treating Slavic elements as foreign intrusions. Modern scholars have modified the picture. Many now imagine a broader zone of formation that included not only former Dacia, but also territories south of the Danube, where Roman and Byzantine influence persisted for centuries. Archaeologists point to Roman settlements, inscriptions, and early Christian terminology as evidence that Latin survived in pockets on both banks of the river. Linguists observe that the Slavic component of Rumanian shows predominantly Bulgarian traits, implying long coexistence in the Balkans. Yet difficulties remain. After the 3rd century, written sources fall almost silent regarding any Romance population north of the Danube. For nearly 800 years, the chronicles mention only Goths, Huns, Avars, and Slavs. Supporters of continuity explain this gap by arguing that medieval authors cared only about ruling peoples and military events, ignoring humble villagers who left no political mark. Occasional hints are interpreted as indirect testimony. Accounts of the Hunnic Empire describe mixed communities speaking several languages, among them one used to communicate with Romans. Later, writers mention Christian groups persisting under barbarian rule. A story from the 6th century tells of a Slav who pretended to be a Roman general because he knew Latin, suggesting that the language was still understood in the north. Another episode records soldiers in the Balkan mountains shouting a Romance command during a panic, evidence, it is claimed, of a Latin-speaking local population. The nature of contacts across the Danube after the Roman retreat is also debated. Some historians argue that trade continued actively. Coins and Byzantine goods found at sites like Susidava indicate exchanges supervised by frontier garrisons. Markets on the riverbanks may have connected communities on both sides, allowing ideas and faith to circulate even without political control. Whatever their precise origin, the Vlachs of the Middle Ages lived at the intersection of civilizations. Their annual migrations followed ancient paths from summer pastures to winter lowlands. They interacted with Hungarians on the Pannonian Plain, with Slavs in the forests of Galicia, with Saxon miners in Transylvania, and with Greeks in the southern mountains. Each encounter left a mark on language and custom. The vocabulary that spread with them reveals everyday realities. Words for flutes and songs suggest evenings beside the fold. Terms for vats, rennet, and various cheeses reflect a complex dairy technology. Names for carts, bridles, and horses speak of travel. Expressions for fear, joy, or leadership hint at social relations within the camps. Even the landscape remembers them. Many mountain passes and clearings bear names derived from Romanian roots. Over time, more and more Vlachs abandoned the wandering life and settled as peasants. In the northern Carpathians, they merged with Slovaks and Poles. In the east, with Ukrainians and Russians. Only in the southern Balkans did compact Romanian-speaking communities survive. Yet the linguistic heritage they left behind across half a continent testifies to centuries when shepherd trails served as arteries of cultural exchange. Procopius describes a frontier that was never as simple as a single river line. In the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, Roman rulers did not limit themselves to fortifying the southern bank of the lower Danube. Small forts and isolated tower posts were also planted at scattered points on the northern side, creating watchful outposts that could signal danger, control crossings, and project authority beyond the water. These were often modest structures, sometimes little more than a lone, strong tower, but together they reveal a strategy of presence rather than a clean withdrawal. That forward posture became clearer under Diocletian. His reign saw repeated military operations that did not stop at the river's edge, but pushed deep into the plains to the north. The point was not simply punishment raids. The pattern suggests an attempt to restore leverage across the lower Danube and to pull the nearby hinterland back into Rome's orbit through force, intimidation, and renewed control of routes. By the early 4th century, the result was a noticeable strengthening of Roman influence north of the river, even if it remained uneven and constantly contested. The largest and most ambitious step came under Constantine. During his rule, imperial control moved into the southern parts of the regions known today as Oltenia and Muntenia, likely reaching a major defensive earthwork that marked the northern limit of the occupied zone. This was the most substantial expansion north of the lower Danube since the earlier abandonment of the province created in Trajan's time. It did not last for centuries, but it was not a brief episode either. For roughly 4 decades, the empire held a real bridgehead across the river, enough to require roads, supplies, garrisons, and an administrative logic that went beyond a single isolated fort. Nothing illustrates the scale of that effort more than Constantine's bridge across the Danube between Uskus and Suceava. Spanning about 2.4 kilometers, it was an engineering statement as much as a practical structure. A bridge of that size is hard to explain as a convenience for one small stronghold. It fits better as infrastructure built to serve a larger plan. A sustained domination of a wide territory north of the river where troops needed to move quickly, supply lines had to be reliable, and the river could not be allowed to remain a barrier whenever campaigns or reinforcements were required. Archaeologists later identified remains associated with the crossing, along with a milestone found a little under 1.5 kilometers from Celle on the Danube, tangible traces of a route system designed to function as part of an imperial landscape. The occupation was not only about walls and marching columns. Roads were repaired and brought back into working order. The route linking Suceava to the northern defensive line was restored, and the connection between Uskus and Serdica was improved as well, showing attention to both the frontier and the interior communications that fed it. At Suceava itself, the main tower was repaired on the site of the modern settlement at Celle near Carabia. Excavations there revealed a soldier's world in detail. Jewellery, weapons, and everyday objects that belonged to the men stationed at the post, along with evidence from the town area that points to civilian activity. Metal objects, mirrors, and wine amphorae appear among the finds, and some goods arrived from far to the south and east, including imports tied to the Aegean sphere. These materials suggest more than a temporary camp. They hint at an urban rhythm, trade links, and a population living alongside the military presence, at least during the years when the bridgehead was functioning. For a long stretch after the formal abandonment of Trajan's Dacia and before the shock of the Hunnic invasion, a chain of fortifications also existed along parts of the northern bank of the lower Danube. The number of sites was not trivial, and they were spread across a wide arc of river territory. For about 1.5 centuries, these strongpoints allowed Rome to dominate key sections of the Danubian corridor, not by holding every mile of land, but by controlling crossings, river traffic, and the approaches that mattered most. Suceava, occupied by a Roman garrison for generations, appears to have played a central role in this defensive network. In the 5th century, it suffered catastrophic destruction twice, apparently in Hunnic attacks, and was then abandoned for a time as imperial priorities shifted and resources tightened. Another major military centre in this frontier world was Drobeta, at modern Turnu Severin. Written sources and archaeological evidence agree that it remained significant, with mounted units and auxiliary forces stationed there in the early 5th century. Material finds show alterations to the camp and new construction during the 3rd and 4th centuries, suggesting continuous adaptation rather than a single building phase. A smaller fort was established a few miles north of Drobeta at Pucine, strengthening the depth of the defensive zone. Farther along, at Dierna, a command unit connected to a famous legion was installed. The excavated camp there was compact, roughly square in plan, and its recovery was complicated by later modern changes to the landscape, when a large artificial lake was created for the Iron Gate hydroelectric system. Even so, the coin finds from the time of Diocletian and Constantine are telling, because they mark phases of intense activity and investment. Dierna's position made it responsible for guarding a vulnerable corridor, where attackers could move from one valley into the Danube zone. Other points along the river show similar signs of fortification and garrison life. At Turnu Magurele, traces of a fortress, pottery fragments, and coins indicate a defended site with continued use in late antiquity. At Pogegena de Sus, on the northern shore, bricks bearing the stamp of a 4th century legionary unit were found, the kind of durable administrative signature that the Roman army left wherever it built and rebuilt. Taken together, the evidence supports an image of a frontier that was active and layered. Not a single line, but a system of posts and stations that allowed imperial power to reach across the river when conditions permitted. In the early 6th century, the Danubian story entered a new phase as the Eastern Empire expanded again toward the lower river. Large numbers of towers and towns in the Balkans were rebuilt, and the scale of construction was massive. Procopius lists hundreds of restored sites and makes clear that some works extended to the northern shore as well. Certain fortresses and towers beyond the river are named as strong places intended to block routes used by raiders and to limit the ability of hostile groups to break southward. In this period, places such as Lederata in the Banat, the fortified site at Zernes, associated with the earlier Dierna, Daphne, and a tower at Turnu Magurele are presented as part of a renewed defensive program. The point was not simply to repair old walls for pride. The aim was to reshape movement across the frontier and to make the river barrier meaningful, again through watchpoints, supply bases, and garrisons. Susidava reappears in this renewed landscape. After its earlier disasters and abandonment, it was restored under Justinian as part of a deliberate effort to seal the frontier and prevent hostile forces from using northern approaches to penetrate the south. At the site, objects in a distinctly 6th century Eastern imperial style have been found, and coins help anchor their date. There is also a thick layer of ash from the end of that century, along with iron points associated with Avar weaponry. That burnt horizon speaks to the violence that ultimately overwhelmed these defences. The Avar devastations mark the collapse of Eastern imperial power in much of the lower Danube region, at least in the strong, organised form implied by major restoration projects. Justinian's legislation and administrative decisions also reveal that the state still imagined authority reaching beyond the Danube, not only in a military sense but in political and ecclesiastical planning. Documents from his reign speak of fortresses on both shores and mention specific settlements beyond the river that had been brought back under imperial control. Other provisions show attention to the organisation of dioceses, the handling of appeals, and the urgent human realities of frontier war, including measures linked to ransoming captives. Even the language of punishment and relocation in fiscal enforcement hints at a world where military units could be shifted to guard distant borders, including the river frontier itself, showing how closely defence and administration were intertwined. Alongside military rebuilding, church organisation was used as another instrument of consolidation. Justinian's reforms included directives that placed certain northern localities under the authority of a major archiepiscopal centre and under the administration of an important prefecture. The wording makes plain that these were places beyond the Danube that had again come under imperial rule. This matters because it suggests an official expectation of lasting authority, at least enough to justify jurisdiction, hierarchy, and institutional oversight. In frontier regions, such steps often followed the flag, but they also helped stabilize populations, encourage settlement, and reinforce identity through structures that could outlast a single campaign season. From this combination of texts and archaeology emerges a broader interpretation. The bridgeheads and forts on the northern bank, together with the temporary annexation of parts of the Wallachian plain, helped preserve links across the river for centuries after the end of the earlier province. Contacts did not depend on one channel alone. Movement could be driven by trade, by forced displacement, by recruitment into military service, by the exchange of prisoners, by marriages that tied communities together, and by the constant push and pull of opportunity and danger along a militarized border. The physical evidence of imported goods, repaired roads, stamped bricks, and coin series fits that picture of sustained connection. All of this also explains why the lower Danube frontier has been treated as crucial evidence in debates about long-term continuity north of the river, the shaping of later Romance-speaking populations, and the spread of Christianity in regions once under Roman rule. The argument is not that the north remained a calm and fully governed imperial province. It is that the imperial presence, even when reduced to fortified nodes and short-lived occupations, did not vanish cleanly, and that the frontier remained porous and active. The picture is one of endurance under pressure, rebuilding, destruction, return, and collapse, repeated across centuries until the late 6th century brought a decisive break. Much later, in discussing the ethnic and political landscape of Transylvania in the 10th century, medieval narrative sources describe local rulers and small principalities that supposedly existed before the arrival and consolidation of Hungarian power. These accounts present leaders in Kristiania, the Banat, and Transylvania proper, and they describe conflicts around fortresses, sieges, and agreements with local populations after defeats. At the same time, the stories raise doubts because of repeating patterns in the way victories are framed, and because some names appear to echo place names, rather than independently confirmed individuals. Even so, the accounts have been used to argue that some form of political organisation existed in the region, and that the population was mixed, with multiple groups present. Later texts and archaeological work have sometimes been brought in to support parts of this narrative, especially where there is independent confirmation of certain places or later successors. When the focus returns to archaeology, the material record in post-Roman Dacia Triana is often presented as the strongest basis for arguing that a Romanized population persisted after the official withdrawal. Many sites yield pottery forms and techniques that continue provincial Roman traditions, sometimes mixed with non-Roman elements that reflect new conditions and contact with neighbouring groups. In the zones closest to the Danube, continuity is generally easier to trace because imperial influence and military presence remained stronger there for longer. Coin finds are especially important in this discussion because they can show long sequences of activity or reveal interruptions followed by renewed circulation in the 4th century and beyond. At some settlements, Roman-style ceramics appear alongside local handmade wares, suggesting not a simple replacement of populations, but an evolving material culture, shaped by survival, adaptation, and external influence. Across different locations, the pattern repeats with local variation. Roman, provincial pottery traditions remain visible. Some settlements show signs of life into the 4th or 5th centuries, and in a few places the reuse of older urban spaces indicates impoverished communities sheltering among ruins after the end of formal administration. Cemeteries and burial customs add another layer because rites and grave goods can reflect long-standing tradition as well as new contacts. Some burial inventories include objects typical of late Roman horizons, while the absence or presence of styles associated with migrating groups becomes a key point in debates over attribution. In this kind of evidence, the most persuasive picture is rarely one of perfect continuity everywhere. It is a landscape of survival that is stronger in some corridors than others, and that changes in intensity as the political and military balance shifts. Glass objects form one of the clearest signs of long-distance contact in the cemetery. Every piece of glass appears to have arrived from outside the region, yet they are surprisingly frequent. The finds include vessels of several shapes, bracelets, and a wide variety of beads. Most of the vessels have close parallels in Western Europe, in the cultural horizon often called Zantana de Mureș, and in territories that correspond to modern Hungary. Production centres for such glassware are known along the Rhine, especially around Cologne, but workshops in Pannonia were also active. The pieces recovered at Bratii most likely reached the site through these Danubian trade routes. The beads follow the same pattern. They belong to types spread across much of Europe during the 4th century and are typical of the material world shared by many communities beyond the imperial frontiers. Objects carved from bone add another layer to the picture. Combs dominate this group, ranging from small pocket-sized examples to larger pieces almost 10 centimeters wide. Such combs are familiar from late Roman settlements and from cemeteries associated with the Santana de Mureș Cherniahov horizon. Tiles and bricks were also found in notable quantity, though their character is rougher than the neatly fired building material of the classical Roman period. The clay is coarse and the pieces are bulky, suggesting a more improvised production. Their presence in the graves probably points to the reuse of material taken from an older settlement nearby, a reminder that the community lived among the remnants of earlier centuries. Other burial sites in Transylvania display similar complexities. At Cluj, for example, Roman sarcophagi were reused for later interments. The grave goods are modest, but a simple cross, a pair of earrings, and iron nails suggest a date after the imperial era. In the wider area around the former Roman town of Napoca, more than 24 coins from the late 3rd and 4th centuries have been discovered, hinting at continued activity long after the official withdrawal of Roman administration. At Ianut, construction work in the 20th century uncovered a small group of cremation urns near the remains of a rural villa. Only one vessel survived intact. It was made on a wheel from a reddish paste and followed forms familiar from provincial Roman pottery, though the quality of the clay shows a slight decline compared with earlier standards. The find illustrates how local craftsmanship continued established traditions even as economic conditions changed. Lecința de Mureș produced a particularly revealing burial dated around the year 300. The urn was almost certainly manufactured in a Roman workshop at nearby Cristești and contained cremated bones along with a silver brooch of a type known from eastern regions. The combination of a Roman funerary rite and an object of Eastern fashion reflects a world where cultural currents overlapped. The grave is best understood as belonging to a community that still followed Roman habits, while absorbing influences carried across the frontier. At Moigrad, within the ruins of a former municipium, a cluster of inhumation graves was found inside the remains of a Roman building equipped with a hypocaust. Most of the tombs had been disturbed and contained no objects, which makes precise dating difficult. Their position among the ruins suggests use after the decline of the town. But the absence of clear grave goods leaves room for uncertainty. Proștea Mecher yielded a solitary skeleton, buried with pottery fragments of fine grey and red ware, closely resembling types known from Roman Dacia. A coin of Philip the Arab and a brooch point to a date around the turn of the 4th century. The assemblage indicates that the deceased belonged to a milieu that still relied on Roman forms of material culture. 2 cremation graves at Saraceni appear to belong to the decades immediately after the Roman military left the province. The handmade vessel placed in one of the tombs follows provincial models, suggesting that elements of the local population continued their earlier customs for some time. A similar interpretation has been proposed for the cemetery at Sfântu Gheorghe, where 1 cremation and 1 inhumation grave were discovered. The rite resembles practices known from Roman Dacia, and the pottery fits within that tradition, though the precise chronology remains debated. The site at Soperul de Campi adds further nuance. 3 urns were uncovered there, only one of which could be saved. The vessel was carefully made on a wheel and shows strong echoes of provincial Roman workmanship. The burial probably dates to the later 3rd century, a time when older traditions had begun to erode, but had not yet disappeared. Material of Christian character offers another perspective on these centuries. The spread of the new faith in the former province was slower than in many other parts of the empire, perhaps because of the region's social structure and its relative distance from major ecclesiastical centres. Yet, by the 4th century, Christian communities were clearly present along the Danube, and objects linked to worship have been found in several Transylvanian locations. These items, including lamps and inscriptions, are stylistically similar to pieces produced in Italy, North Africa, and the Balkans, indicating that they were imported rather than locally made. The most celebrated example is a bronze votive plate discovered near Beerton. It bears the monogram of Christ and a short Latin dedication naming a man called Zenovius. The object almost certainly formed part of a chandelier that once hung in a small sanctuary. The use of Latin suggests that the community for whom it was intended was familiar with that language, and the find has often been taken as evidence for a Christian group rooted in local Roman traditions. Whether that group consisted of descendants of earlier inhabitants, newcomers from the empire, or a mixture of both remains an open question, but the object shows that religious life continued in forms recognizable across the wider Roman world. Another inscription, engraved on a silver brooch, later turned into a ring, was found in the Mureș Valley. The simple phrase, wishing long life to a woman named Quartina, lacks explicitly Christian symbols, yet it reflects the persistence of Latin literacy in the region during the 4th century. Coins provide a broader framework for understanding economic connections. After the official withdrawal, the circulation of imperial currency did not cease, though it fluctuated sharply. In the decades immediately following the departure, coins are relatively rare, but during the reign of Constantine their numbers rise dramatically. Bronze issues minted at Siscia and Sirmium appear across Transylvania, the Banat and Oltenia, marking renewed links with the empire during a period of political expansion north of the Danube. After the Hunnic invasion, the flow diminishes again, and gold coins become more common, probably reflecting tribute payments and the presence of new ruling groups. Many coins were found near former Roman camps and settlements, yet others appear in places with no earlier remains, showing that monetary exchange reached beyond the old urban centres. Some hoards contain a mixture of early imperial silver and later bronze pieces, suggesting that families may have preserved their savings across generations. The overall volume of currency was modest, and barter must have played a major role in daily life. But the coins demonstrate that the region was never entirely cut off from the Romano-Byzantine economy. Linguistic arguments have also been drawn into the discussion of continuity. The distribution of certain Latin-derived words in Western Transylvania has been interpreted as the survival of an ancient core area where Roman speech endured. Other scholars have pointed to the heavy Slavic influence on Romanian, arguing that the language must have taken shape in close contact with South Slavic communities, most likely somewhere in the Central Balkans. The absence of clear Old Germanic loanwords, despite the long presence of Goths and Gepids north of the Danube, has been used to support the idea that the main development of Romanian occurred south of the river before later migrations carried it north again. Toponymy complicates the picture. Very few place names of unequivocal Latin origin survive in modern Romania. Most river and settlement names are Slavic or later, and this has been explained either as the result of translation by Slavic settlers, or as evidence that new populations introduced their own nomenclature. The names of major rivers such as the Olt, Mureș, and Someș have been connected with ancient forms, but whether these were transmitted through Latin, Slavic, or other channels remains debated. Historical narratives from the Middle Ages add another layer of uncertainty. Chronicles describing the situation in Transylvania during the 10th century mention local leaders and mixed populations, yet these texts were written centuries later and blend memory with legend. Archaeology can confirm the existence of certain fortresses and settlements, but it cannot easily identify the ethnic labels used by medieval authors. Archaeological exploration across the lands of the former Roman province has revealed many traces of Dacian-style life continuing into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Pottery, shaped in older traditions, modest villages and burial grounds appear in numerous locations, suggesting that not all aspects of the pre-Roman world vanished with the arrival of imperial rule. Yet these discoveries also tell another story, one marked by disruption, rather than simple survival. When researchers compared the landscape before and after the conquest, they found that more than 200 settlements had existed in the 2 centuries leading up to Roman occupation. Of these, fewer than half showed any activity during the Roman period, and only a single site offered clear evidence of an uninterrupted line of habitation from the Dacian age into the new order. Such a dramatic break at village level sits uneasily beside images of a thriving, densely populated province. Historians have proposed explanations. The Roman authorities may have deliberately gathered scattered hamlets into larger, more manageable communities, preferring open ground, where supervision was easier and taxation more efficient. Estimating the size of the Dacian population under Roman rule remains an elusive task. Ancient writers offered figures that seem impressive but are difficult to verify. One source claimed that in earlier times Dacian kings could summon vast armies, while later accounts reduced those numbers considerably. Modern interpretations vary just as widely. Some scholars imagine a province of 500,000 souls at the time of the last Dacian king, while others point to reports that tens of thousands were taken as prisoners after the wars. Whether these captives represented a small fraction or the bulk of the male population is impossible to determine. Because firm demographic evidence is lacking, debate has long been shaped by broader assumptions about identity and language. Earlier generations of thinkers, eager to emphasize the Latin character of the region, minimize the presence of native Dacians altogether. Later discoveries of rural sites encouraged a reversal, and many began to speak of a substantial indigenous element surviving beneath the Roman veneer. Arguments were even built upon a handful of supposedly ancient words, yet linguistic specialists caution that none of these terms can be securely linked to the Dacian tongue. More tangible information exists in inscriptions and military records. Across the province, thousands of Latin names appear carved in stone, but only a few dozen unmistakably Dacian ones accompany them. Likewise, units of the Roman army recruited from local tribes were surprisingly rare. These facts suggest that the indigenous presence, though real, may not have been as dominant as sometimes imagined. Religious life points in the same direction. In neighbouring Balkan regions, native cults persisted for centuries beside Roman deities, leaving behind hundreds of reliefs and sanctuaries. Within the territory north of the Danube, however, no clear trace of traditional Dacian worship has been identified. The spiritual landscape seems almost entirely expressed in Roman forms. Romanization itself is a complex and contested concept. The province existed for less than 2 centuries, a short span when measured against the slow rhythms of language change. Many settlers arrived from distant corners of the empire, bringing with them Greek, Syriac, Illyrian, and other tongues. Latin served as the language of administration and the army. Yet daily speech in towns and villages must have been a mosaic. Inscriptions primarily reflect official acts and the voices of soldiers, offering little insight into how ordinary people communicated at home. The countryside, where most inhabitants lived, has yielded relatively few texts, and those that exist often belong to travelling officials rather than to resident farmers. Urban centres present a similarly mixed picture. The provincial capital was populated by merchants and craftsmen from Asia Minor and the Near East, organised in associations that preserved memories of their homelands. In mining districts, the majority were Illyrians and Greeks whose knowledge of Latin appears limited. Even in the largest cities, many of the gods honoured were Eastern in origin, revealing communities that retained strong cultural identities. Towns in the province were creations of Roman colonisation, rather than continuations of earlier Dacian centres. And when imperial authority withdrew, they faded rapidly, unlike the enduring cities of the western provinces. The abandonment of the province in the 3rd century therefore marked a profound turning point. Whether every inhabitant departed with the legions cannot be known, but parallels elsewhere show that isolated Roman groups left beyond the frontier rarely maintained their language for long. In Britain, for example, centuries of Roman presence and numerous Latin place names did not prevent the eventual disappearance of Latin speech after the legions left. Similar processes could easily have unfolded along the Danube. For several centuries after the withdrawal, the river became the defensive line of the empire. Byzantine writers describe a world of constant alarms. Goths, Huns, Avars, and Slavs pressing against the frontier, while emperors rebuilt walls, stationed fleets, and fortified towns. These measures were aimed at protection, not expansion. Bridgeheads on the northern bank functioned as military outposts, rather than centres of cultural outreach. Trade continued, as it did across many frontiers, but such exchanges seldom transformed the languages of those beyond imperial control. The picture that emerges is one of a contested borderland, not a zone where Latin life could flourish, uninterrupted. By the 6th century, the Danubian provinces themselves were struggling to survive. Chroniclers speak of devastated fields and towns rebuilt again and again. In this environment, any remnants of Roman culture north of the river would have faced overwhelming pressure. The gradual silence of ancient sources concerning these lands reflects not deliberate neglect, but the fading relevance of a region beyond the empire's grasp. For more than 200 years, historians have argued over a medieval narrative known as the Gesta Hungarorum, a work traditionally attributed to the anonymous notary of King Béla III of Hungary. The text was almost certainly written at the end of the 12th century, and everything about its language and tone reflects the political atmosphere of that era rather than the distant age it claims to describe. The author drew heavily on classical and medieval literature, on biblical passages, and on popular heroic tales circulating in Western Europe. He openly dismissed village legends and the songs of wandering minstrels, preferring to construct his story from learned books and from the traditions preserved among the noble families of his own day. The manuscript that has survived contains 57 chapters, opening with a learned prologue in which the writer explains how his youthful fascination with Troy and Alexander inspired him to record the genealogy of the Hungarian kings and the epic journey of their ancestors from the steppe to the Carpathian Basin. The early chapters present an imaginative geography of Scythia and describe the election of the leader, Almos, followed by a dramatic account of the migration westward. The Hungarians are said to have crossed the Volga, passed through the lands of Suzdal and Kiev, and received the allegiance of Cuman chiefs and Russian princes before moving toward Galicia and finally Pannonia. The bulk of the work is devoted to the conquest of the Carpathian Basin. Battles are narrated in colourful detail. Clashes with Menomorut, lord of the Khazars, campaigns against Slavic and Bulgarian rulers, and the seizure of Transylvania, where a Vlach leader named Gelu supposedly reigned. Later chapters describe operations in Dalmatia and Croatia and the drawing of the new frontiers of Hungary. The closing section recounts raids to the west and the settlement of foreign peoples during the 10th century. Yet the purpose of this narrative was never to provide an objective chronicle. Its real aim was to glorify the House of Arpad and to legitimize the land holdings of the aristocracy living 3 centuries after the events. By multiplying heroes and enemy chiefs, the author could attach every noble family to some victorious ancestor. Modern scholars have shown that he often invented names from local place names, following a popular medieval habit. A river or hill called Loborsi or Tursul became, in his story, a fallen Bulgarian or Cuman chieftain. From fragments of older legends, he created composite figures, such as Menomorut, blending scattered traditions into a convenient opponent for the Hungarians. When the tale is compared with genuine 9th century records, the gaps are striking. Major events known from contemporary sources, the defence of Pannonia by Braslav, the battle near present-day Bratislava, are absent, while more than 20 real political leaders of the period are never mentioned. The peoples who actually inhabited the basin at that time, Avars, Moravians, Bavarian Franks, receive little attention, whereas groups unknown in the 9th century, such as the Cumans, play prominent roles. These anachronisms mirror the world of the 12th century, rather than that of the Migration Age. Even the ethnic labels are misleading. The term used for Vlachs in the text could, in medieval Hungarian, denote Italians or Frenchmen, not necessarily the Romance-speaking shepherds later associated with the name. Because of these contradictions, the Gesta Hungarorum must be read as a literary creation, rather than a dependable historical source. It reflects the ideals and political needs of its own age, not the realities of the 9th century. The author knew little about the true ethnic mosaic of the early Carpathian Basin, and his depiction of Vlachs and Slavs in Transylvania cannot be taken as factual testimony. Archaeology offers a different window onto the past. Across Europe, the material influence of Rome reached far beyond the imperial frontiers. Coins, weapons, Pottery styles and religious figurines travelled to Scandinavia, the Baltic, and even the shores of India. Germanic societies adopted Roman building techniques and coinage. Latin words entered their languages along with wine, trade, and military service. None of this, however, implied Romanization in a linguistic sense. Objects move more easily than peoples, and the presence of Roman goods in a distant land says little about the language spoken there. The same caution applies to the territory of former Roman Dacia. After the imperial withdrawal in the late 3rd century, settlements displaying Roman-style artifacts continued for a time. But many of these sites also reveal the arrival of new groups: free Dacians, Carps, Goths, whose material culture gradually replaced earlier forms. Cemeteries once labelled as evidence of a Daco-Roman population contain rituals and pottery closer to those of neighbouring barbarian cultures than to those of the Roman world. Only a handful of villages show any continuity from the Roman era into the 4th century, and even there the traces are thin and ambiguous. Coins discovered north of the Danube illustrate the problem. Roman money circulated widely across Europe and was used by many peoples for trade or ornament. Hoards buried during periods of turmoil may reflect fear and flight rather than settled communities. After the Roman retreat, such hoards disappear almost entirely, suggesting that the inhabitants did not expect to return to former homes. Latin inscriptions and occasional Christian objects were most likely imports from the empire, carried by merchants or soldiers, not signs of a native Latin-speaking society. Urban life in the province collapsed quickly. Stone building ceased, workshops fell silent, and burial practices moved into the abandoned streets. Unlike post-Roman Britain, where towns lingered for generations, the cities of Dacia faded within decades. By the time the Huns swept across the region at the end of the 4th century, organised urban communities had vanished. Rural sites tell a similar story of disruption, with many settlements founded only after the imperial departure and others abandoned soon afterward. From the 6th century onward, the Roman imprint on material culture diminished everywhere. Pottery became more uniform and barbarized, making ethnic distinctions almost impossible. With the arrival of Slavic culture in the 7th century, even these faint traces disappeared. What remained were scattered artifacts, a bronze lamp here, a pot lid marked with a cross there, insufficient to prove the survival of a Romanized population. For many years, scholars have tried to explain what happened to the Romanized population that once lived north of the lower Danube. One common idea suggests that, when the Huns and later the Avars began to raid the region, the local people abandoned their villages and withdrew into the remote valleys of the Carpathian Mountains. According to this view, the repeated waves of violence made settled farming impossible. Communities that had lived for generations in open plains would have sought safety in the hills, where life was harsher but more secure. The gradual disappearance of many rural settlements during the centuries after the Roman withdrawal is often interpreted as the result of this long period of instability. Another argument proposes that this movement into the mountains changed the very way these people lived. Farmers supposedly turned into shepherds, following their flocks between high summer pastures and the milder lowlands near the Danube. Through these seasonal journeys, they would have remained in contact with the Roman towns south of the river, allowing the Latin language and traditions to survive. Yet this explanation raises difficult questions. Each autumn, those same shepherds would have returned to regions controlled by the very groups they were trying to escape. The theory, attractive as it sounds, contains contradictions that have never been fully resolved. Historians themselves disagree about when such a flight might have taken place. Some place it in the late 4th century, during the first Hunnic attacks, while others extend the process into the 5th and 6th centuries. Descriptions are often vague, speaking only of distant valleys and protected hillsides. Later writers imagine that, after a brief period of hiding, these people reappeared on the plains and quickly absorbed the surrounding Slavic population. Yet no material evidence supports this dramatic return. Archaeologists working in the mountain zones have found no traces of large communities from the migration period. Modern researchers in Romania have gradually abandoned the older romantic image of a people preserved intact in alpine refuges. Linguistic arguments have also been used to defend the idea of an ancient population in Transylvania. In the 1930s, certain Latin words were discovered only in the western parts of the region, and some scholars believed these were relics of Roman times. But similar patterns exist in the dialects of the Balkans, where it is clear that communities arrived much later. Words can disappear in one area and survive in another for many reasons, and their distribution does not necessarily reveal where a language was born. Later studies showed that many supposed core areas were outside the Roman Empire altogether, which undermines the argument entirely. The vocabulary of modern Romanian demonstrates how fluid these processes can be. Different regions use different terms for basic concepts, such as snow, abdomen, or shepherd. Some of these words are inherited from Latin, others come from Slavic, Turkish, or Hungarian. Their boundaries follow the paths of later migrations, rather than the map of the Roman province. Even the most ancient-sounding expressions appear across the Balkans, among Aromanian and other related dialects, proving that preservation in a single corner of Transylvania cannot be taken as evidence of uninterrupted continuity. Religious terminology tells a similar story. Many Christian words in Romanian are indeed Latin in origin, but they have close parallels in Albanian and South Slavic languages. This suggests that they were acquired in the southern Balkans during the early Middle Ages, not in isolated northern enclaves. The pattern of Slavic influence is particularly revealing. The earliest layer of Slavic loanwords is shared by all Romanian dialects, while the largest group reflects the pronunciation of medieval Bulgarian from the 11th and 12th centuries. Such features point to a long period of contact south of the Danube. If the language had developed mainly in Transylvania, we would expect traces of Ukrainian or Western Slavic influence, yet these are absent. Equally striking is what the language does not contain. Historical sources and archaeological finds show that Goths and Gepids dominated much of present-day Romania between the 4th and 7th centuries. In Western Europe, these peoples left hundreds of Germanic words in French, Italian, and Spanish. Romanian, however, preserves none at all, not even personal names. This silence is difficult to reconcile with the idea of centuries-long coexistence north of the Danube. Place names provide perhaps the clearest evidence. Across Europe, newcomers usually adopt the geographical names they find, even when the original population disappears. England still preserves Roman endings. Austria retains dozens of Latin town names, and Hungary inherited many from earlier settlers. North of the lower Danube, the situation is entirely different. Not a single Roman settlement name survived directly into Romanian. The great rivers, Mureș, Olt, Someș, Timiș, reached the language through Slavic or Hungarian forms. This suggests that when the Slavs arrived in the 6th and 7th centuries, they encountered no Latin-speaking communities able to transmit the old names. The structure of Romanian dialects supports the same conclusion. Despite being spoken today by millions over a vast territory, the language shows remarkably little internal variation. Such uniformity is typical of populations that expanded relatively recently into new lands, like the English settlers of North America. If Romanian had been spoken north of the Danube for more than 1,000 years, stronger regional differences would almost certainly have developed. The absence of a distinct Transylvanian dialect implies that the region was populated from neighbouring areas, especially Moldavia and Wallachia, rather than serving as the original homeland. Taken together, these linguistic and geographical clues point toward the southern Balkans as the cradle of the Romanian language. Its deep connections with Albanian, Greek, and Bulgarian place it within the core zone of the Balkan linguistic world, centered in Macedonia and nearby regions. Only after the 11th century do Romanian speakers begin to appear in large numbers north of the Danube, where they gradually spread into Transylvania and the plains beyond. The archaeological record of the centuries following the Roman withdrawal shows a complex mosaic of peoples in these northern lands. Free Dacians, Carps, Sarmatians, Goths, Huns, Gepids, and Avars all left their mark. Cultures rose and vanished, settlements were abandoned, and new traditions replaced the old. Yet amid this turbulence there is no trace of a stable Latin community, capable of preserving Roman names or shaping the language of later generations. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a nomadic power known to history as the Huns was already active on the northern frontiers of China, in regions that today belong to the provinces of Shaanxi, Shanxi, and Hebei. Pressure from the Chinese states gradually pushed them westward, and over generations they crossed the vast Eurasian steppe until they reached the lands around the Volga River. For decades they remained there, gathering strength and absorbing other nomadic groups. Then, in the year 375, they launched a sudden assault on the Gothic territories of Moldavia and Muntenia. The Gothic resistance collapsed, and within a remarkably short time, the Huns became masters of the entire region that had once been dominated by Germanic tribes. Contemporary writers describe the Huns living in both Dacia and Pannonia alongside many subject peoples. They did not form a single uniform nation, but rather a military confederation that included remnants of earlier populations. There are even records that they intermingled with the Carps, a local group that had survived the Roman withdrawal. Archaeology confirms their presence through scattered finds of jewellery, bronze cauldrons, and horse equipment discovered along the valleys of the Pruth, the Buzo, and the Danube, as well as near Brasov and Roman. Unlike other peoples of the period, the Huns left no large cemeteries in these lands, only isolated graves, which reflects their mobile way of life. The height of Hunnic power came in the middle of the 5th century under the leadership of Attila. In 451, their armies clashed with a coalition of Roman and Germanic forces on the plains near Troyes in Gaul. Although the battle did not destroy them, it marked the limit of their expansion. Attila died 2 years later, and in 454 a revolt led by the Gepids defeated the Huns at the river Nidau in Pannonia. With this event, the Hunnic Empire in Europe rapidly dissolved, leaving a political vacuum across the Carpathian Basin. Among those who benefited from the fall of the Huns were the Gepids, another branch of the Germanic world. Originally from the Baltic coast, they had begun to move southward in the 3rd century and had settled near the upper Tisa. During Hunnic domination, many Gepids remained in place, serving their overlords but preserving their identity. After 453, they re-established an independent kingdom and in 471 captured the important city of Sirmium, which became the seat of their rulers. For almost a century they controlled a wide territory, stretching from the Sava to the eastern Carpathians. Their material culture is well known. Villages consisted of large houses surrounded by smaller huts, and their cemeteries followed the rite of inhumation arranged in orderly rows. Typical objects include combs, brooches with multiple buttons, belt fittings decorated with eagle motifs, and pottery made both by hand and on the wheel. Weapons are relatively rare in the graves, suggesting a society that valued display more than constant warfare. Some tombs are oriented west to east and contain Christian symbols, indicating that parts of the population had adopted the new faith by the 6th century. The Gepid kingdom ended in 567 when the Avars, allied with the Lombards, destroyed their power. Yet the Gepids did not vanish immediately. Byzantine chronicles from the early 7th century mention villages of Gepids still existing in the Banat, and excavations have revealed remains dating even to the middle of that century. Under Avar rule, their culture changed. Large, communal cemeteries appeared, horse burials became common, and metalwork began to show strong steppe influence. Agriculture and cattle breeding continued, and workshops of silversmiths and weavers have been identified in several settlements. The Avars themselves arrived from the eastern steppes, probably from regions of Mongolia. By the middle of the 6th century, they had reached southern Russia and soon entered diplomatic relations with Byzantium, offering military assistance in exchange for land and subsidies. After crushing the Gepids, they established a powerful khaganate centered in the Hungarian plain. From there, they launched repeated attacks on the Balkan provinces and even laid siege to Constantinople, together with Persian allies. At their peak, the Avars ruled a vast domain between the Alps, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea. Their society was highly militarized and centered on the horse. More than 30,000 graves have been excavated, many containing complete horse skeletons and elaborate harness. Early Avar art favoured geometric motifs, while after about 720 a new style with plant and animal figures appeared, probably brought by fresh groups from the east. In Transylvania and the Banat Avar remains are less numerous than on the plains but still significant, especially along the valleys of the major rivers. They seem to have lived alongside Slavic communities, forming a mixed frontier society. The Frankish campaigns of 795 and 796 destroyed the Avar heartland, though some groups survived east of the Tisza. By the 9th century, their political power had faded, and only fragments of their material culture remained. Into this changing world, the Slavs had already begun to move. From their homelands north and northeast of the Carpathians, Slavic tribes migrated southward during the 5th century. At first, the Gepid frontier limited their penetration into Transylvania, but by the 6th century they were firmly established along the lower Danube. Byzantine writers describe regions called Sclavinia, inhabited by tribes known as Sclavines and Antes. These groups frequently raided across the river, sometimes reaching the outskirts of Constantinople. Relations with the Avars alternated between alliance and conflict. Archaeological traces of the earlier Slavs appear in Moldavia at Suceava Shipot, where rectangular huts with stone hearths and handmade pottery resemble cultures of the middle Dnieper. The vast cremation cemetery at Sarata Monteoru, with more than 1,500 graves, represents the same Eastern tradition. Later, in the 7th and 8th centuries, settlements multiplied at Halincia, Dorobanci, and many other sites. Pottery began to be made on a simple wheel and decorated with horizontal and wavy lines, marking the emergence of what scholars call the Balkan Danube culture. This cultural zone eventually stretched from the Balkan Mountains far into Muntenia and Moldavia, and was closely linked to the rising Bulgarian state. In Transylvania, the Slavs appeared somewhat later. The first unmistakable object, a clay baking plate, was found in an Avar cemetery and dates from the early 7th century. Soon after, cremation cemeteries were established along the Târnava and Mureș valleys. The large necropolis at Brate, begun in the early 8th century, contained hundreds of graves and shows both Slavic and Avar elements. Some artifacts connect these communities with the Western Slavs of Moravia and Slovakia, others with Eastern groups beyond the Carpathians. The region became a meeting ground of different Slavic traditions. During the 9th century, the Bulgarian Empire expanded north of the Danube and reached into southern Transylvania. Archaeology reveals Bulgarian pottery and cemeteries along the middle Mureș, near important salt mines that the Bulgarians sought to control. The old Roman city of Apulum received a new name meaning White Castle, which later passed into both Romanian and Hungarian usage. Bulgarian domination, however, was short-lived and ended in the early 10th century as the state weakened. Throughout these centuries, many earlier peoples faded from the scene. Attempts have been made to identify Romanized communities within the Slavic cultures, but such interpretations rely on ambiguous pottery shapes or on Byzantine influences that do not require the presence of Latin speakers. The material record overwhelmingly reflects Slavic, Avar, or Bulgarian traditions, rather than a surviving Roman world. The linguistic landscape that later emerged across Romania bears the strongest imprint of these Slavic centuries. Place names of Slavic origin appear in every region regardless of geography. Rivers, towns, and villages from the Danube to the Carpathians carry names derived from words for black, oak, dust, mountain pass, or gold. Many of these names were borrowed into Romanian only in the 12th century, or even later, which shows that Slavic speech remained dominant for a very long time. Only the names of the largest rivers survived from antiquity, and even these reached Romanian through Slavic or Hungarian forms. The Mureș, the Olt, the Someș, and the Timiș all bear the marks of medieval transmission. The Danube itself entered Romanian as Dunăre, a form shaped by Slavic pronunciation. Such evidence suggests that when Slavic settlers arrived, they did not encounter a Latin-speaking population capable of preserving the old toponymy. A new chapter opened with the arrival of the Hungarians at the beginning of the 10th century. Byzantine sources describe them already settled along the Tisza, the Mureș, and the Criș rivers. Archaeology confirms this with hundreds of cemeteries where warriors were buried with horses and weapons in typical steppe fashion. In Transylvania, these graves cluster along the major river valleys and in the southeastern corner of the region. Hungarian influence can also be traced through an early type of place name, formed with the suffix meaning small or belonging to. Such names spread across the valleys of the Mureș and the Târnava, and across much of the Transylvanian basin before the 12th century. Most were created from ordinary Hungarian words for wheat, forest, pigeon, stone, or village land, showing that Hungarian speakers were deeply rooted in these areas at an early date. Later, many of these names were adopted into Romanian, while others were translated or modified. At the close of the 9th century, a new force entered the lands around the lower Danube. This people, known as the Pechenegs, belonged to the Turkic world of the steppe and moved westward under pressure from rival nomads. Their arrival coincided with a decisive moment in Hungarian history. Together with the Bulgarians, the Pechenegs struck at the Hungarian settlements in the region between the Dniester and the Pruth, an area called Atelkos. The devastation was so severe that the Hungarians abandoned those territories and began their migration toward the Carpathian Basin. The earliest traces of the Pechenegs in what is now Romania appear around the year 930. Archaeological layers from that time show signs of destruction in the southern parts of the land between the Dniester and the Pruth. The earlier Slavic culture there gradually disappeared, suggesting that the newcomers took control of the region. Contemporary Arab writers describe their first raids across the Danube in the 930s, noting that the Pechenegs did not act alone, but were accompanied by other groups, including some Hungarians. By the turn of the millennium, the Pechenegs had occupied the Wallachian plain, while the Byzantine Empire was advancing into northeastern Bulgaria and southern Dobroja. The old withdrew culture that had flourished in those lowlands faded away by the middle of the 11th century. For decades, the Pechenegs launched repeated attacks into the Balkans, threatening both Byzantium and the Bulgarian lands. Their power was finally broken in 1091 when a large Byzantine army, reinforced by allies from the Struma and Vardar valleys, and by Vlachs from Thessaly, defeated them in a decisive battle. The Cumans, another steppe people, fought on the Byzantine side as well. Although often enemies of the Hungarians, the Pechenegs were also settled by Hungarian kings in various parts of Transylvania. One such community lived in the southeastern region around Bariolt and was still mentioned in the 13th century. Documents from the early 1200s speak of Pecheneg soldiers serving in the royal army, and a charter from 1224 refers to a forest shared by Vlachs and Pechenegs in southeastern Transylvania. Archaeological finds, including vessels and settlement layers near Brate and Dabucha, confirm their presence. Little is known about the Pecheneg language. It belonged to the Turkic family and was close to the speech of the Cumans, yet no written texts survive. Their legacy can be traced mainly through place names that preserve their ethnic designation. In the territories beyond the Carpathians, such names appear in Slavic or Romanian forms, while inside Transylvania most derive from the Hungarian version of the name. This distribution reveals where Pecheneg groups were integrated into the medieval Hungarian kingdom, and where they influenced the developing Romanian lands. Toward the end of the 11th century, the dominance of the Pechenegs gave way to that of the Cumans. These were another Turkic confederation that established control over Moldavia and the Wallachian plain, regions later called Black Cumania. Like their predecessors, the Cumans raided the Balkans but also entered into alliances with Bulgarian rulers. The Vlacho-Bulgarian uprising of 1187 relied heavily on Cuman support, showing how deeply they had become involved in regional politics. Cuman warriors also crossed into Transylvania, clashing with Hungarian forces. Some groups eventually settled within the kingdom, especially on the plains between the Danube and the Tisza. At the beginning of the 13th century, missionaries converted many of them to Roman Catholic Christianity, and in 1227 a diocese was organized specifically for their communities in the Milkov Valley. Unlike the Pechenegs, the Cumans left a clearer linguistic imprint. A medieval dictionary compiled by Western missionaries preserves fragments of their language, allowing scholars to identify several Romanian words and many place names of Cuman origin. Names such as Baragan, Caracal, Karaiman, and Teleorman recall their presence on the steppe. More than 40 settlements across the country still bear variations of the name Koman, evidence that the Cumans lived in close contact with the Vlachs. These borrowings entered Romanian directly, without Slavic mediation, which suggests that Romanian-speaking shepherds and Cuman nomads shared the same landscapes during the 12th and 13th centuries. The first explicit references to Vlachs north of the Danube appear only in the later Middle Ages. A Polish chronicle recounts that in 1070, Vlachs fought alongside Ruthenians and Pechenegs in Moldavia. An Armenian geographer of the 13th century remembered Vlachs in those northern regions during the previous century. Byzantine authors of the 12th century mention Vlachs involved in military events beyond the Danube, yet none of these accounts describe permanent settlements. Only after 1200 do documents begin to speak of Vlach communities with defined territories. One charter from 1213 records Germans, Sheklers, Vlachs, and Pechenegs serving together in the army of the Hungarian king without specifying their homelands. A few years later, another document referred to a land of the Vlachs along the southeastern frontier of Transylvania, in the Fargarash area. In 1234, the papacy mentioned Vlachs, living within the Cuman diocese around present-day Focșani. These scattered notices suggest a gradual movement of pastoral groups from the Balkan highlands into the Carpathian zone. The newcomers sought environments suited to their traditional way of life. The southern Carpathians, the mountains of Moldavia, and later the Apuseni offered rich summer pastures and relative security. Earlier inhabitants, Slavs, Hungarians, Cumans, and other Turkic peoples were largely farmers and stock raisers who preferred valleys and plains. The mountainous interior was therefore only sparsely settled. This allowed the Vlachs to expand with little resistance, and their herds were less exposed to the invasions that devastated the lowlands, such as the Tatar onslaught of the 13th century. Over time, their numbers grew, and some groups even moved northward, beyond the Carpathians, where they eventually merged with Slavic populations. The first Vlach political formations emerged in the middle of the 13th century. A royal diploma from 1247 describes several small principalities south of the Carpathians. One lay in the Severin region, another in Oltenia under local leaders named Ioan and Farkas. Between the rivers Jiu and Olt stretched the voivodat of Litovoi, which also included the Hatzeg district on the northern side of the mountains. Farther east, in the Argesh area, ruled Seneslav. These communities possessed their own military forces and formed the nucleus of later states. The Cumans played a significant role in this process. Allied with Vlach chieftains, they provided military strength and political models that encouraged the creation of more centralized authority. In the first half of the 14th century, Basarab united the lands west and east of the Olt, laying the foundations of Wallachia. Soon afterward, a similar consolidation produced the Principality of Moldavia. From these beginnings, the medieval Romanian states gradually took shape, born out of a frontier world where steppe nomads, mountain shepherds, and neighbouring kingdoms had interacted for generations.